Welcome to The Explainer. So I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine a rich, incredibly ancient culture operating right in the middle of our hypermodern, fast-paced world of 2026. What exactly happens when centuries-old traditions collide head-on with modern life? Well, today we're taking a close look at the fascinating, almost slow-motion transformation of Yoruba culture. It's honestly this incredible story of a society navigating just massive historical, social, and economic pressures.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We're going to break down this massive cultural shift into 4 distinct pillars: the religious revolution, the language divide, urbanization and the Japa syndrome, and finally, the global hybrid identity. And then we'll wrap up by analyzing the ultimate outcome to ask, is this culture dying, or is it just evolving? Starting off with pillar number 1, the religious revolution, shift in faith. We're seeing a historic move away from the traditional Orisa deities towards Christianity and Islam, where old practices are increasingly labeled as idolatry or just seen as backward.
Now, you can really see the shift right at the foundation of personal identity, which is how people are named. For centuries, Yoruba life centered around the Orisa deities, and historically you'd see names honoring them, like Ifatumbi. But today, those ancient names are frequently swapped out for biblical or Islamic alternatives, like Jisutumbi, which perfectly aligns with the new dominant faiths. It's a huge, fundamental shift.
And it doesn't just stop at names. It spills over into the actual ceremonies of life. Even the most deeply rooted rites of passage are changing. A traditional naming ceremony used to require very specific, highly symbolic things. We're talking bitter cola, honey, and salt. Today, though, those exact same rites are often conducted by clerics using just a Bible or a Quran. The traditional tactile elements are really losing their place to religious texts.
Moving on to Pillar 2, the language divide, a leaking vessel. English is aggressively taking over as the definitive language of global mobility.
Global communication trends are having a profound impact here. One scholar actually nailed it with this quote, "Language is the vessel of culture, and currently, that vessel has a few leaks." It's so true. In a lot of modern elite homes and formal schools, speaking Yoruba actually carries this vernacular stigma. The native tongue gets pushed to a sort of second-class status, while English is prioritized as the language of intellect and success. This whole linguistic shift has created a really fascinating demographic that the source material brilliantly calls local foreigners. Just think about that evocative term for a second. It perfectly describes a growing number of young Yoruba people living in bustling cities like Lagos. They're totally immersed in the environment, right? They hear the language, they understand it perfectly, but they just can't speak it fluently themselves.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the direct consequence of that intergenerational gap. Because when you lose a spoken language, you aren't just losing vocabulary words. You're losing the deep cultural wisdom that's literally embedded in proverbs. You lose those fading linguistic nuances that give the culture its unique flavor. And maybe most tragically, you risk the total disappearance of rich oral histories that absolutely rely on the native tongue to be passed down.
That brings us to Pillar 3, urbanization and Japa syndrome. This is all about the physical disconnect from the ancestral roots. A massive part of this physical disconnect is the Japa syndrome. This is the widely used term for the massive wave of migration moving millions of Yoruba people abroad to places like the UK, the US, and Canada. And here's the thing. When millions of people transplant their lives, maintaining traditional social etiquettes gets incredibly tough. Physical signs of respect like prostrating, which is known as dobale, or kneeling for elders, are almost impossible to sustain as everyday practices in a foreign Western context.
And even for the folks who stay in modern urban centers back home, the literal architecture of life has completely changed. Just contrast a modern, isolated apartment with the agboile. Historically, this traditional communal family compound was the absolute center of daily Yoruba life. Moving into gated estates and nuclear family apartments physically weakens the daily influence of extended family elders. And remember, those elders are the ultimate traditional gatekeepers of the culture.
Let's look at Pillar 4, the global hybrid identity, and how digital factors are actively remixing the culture.
In our hyper-connected TikTok era, globalization definitely pushes Western norms as the ultimate benchmark for modernity. But here's the catch. Yoruba culture isn't being erased, it's just being heavily remixed into this global hybrid identity. I mean, look at the meteoric rise of Afrobeat music. Young people are celebrating their heritage, sometimes throwing on traditional aso-ebi garments just for a vibe or a fashion statement, but often without actually understanding the deep traditional protocols and histories behind those very clothes.
Finally, Section 5. Dying or evolving?
So the crucial point is, when we synthesize all this data, is this the end of the culture or merely an evolution?
Let's break down this comparison, because the stark contrast between the old and the new impacts literally every facet of daily life. For greetings, prostrating is turning into handshakes or just a casual wave. We've already seen how names tied to deities are becoming religious or Western. In medicine, traditional herbal agbo and spiritual healing are stepping aside for Western medicine and faith healing. In education, formal Western schooling is completely replacing oral history.
And speaking of that shift in education, we really need to highlight exactly what's being left behind here. The concept of omoluabi was the absolute cornerstone of traditional education. It wasn't just about facts. It was a holistic philosophy focusing heavily on character development, oral history, and hands-on apprenticeship. As formal, standardized Western curricula take over, this deeply localized character-building framework is fundamentally slipping away.
But before we jump to the conclusion that the culture is vanishing, we have to look at history. Many scholars argue the culture isn't dying at all, it's just evolving. I mean, look at places like Brazil and Cuba. Yoruba traditions there, like candomblé and santeria, have survived for centuries. And they didn't survive by remaining rigidly static. No, they survived precisely by adapting and blending into new, hybrid forms in the Americas.
Which brings us to this beautiful core concept, Okan. It literally means the soul of the culture. According to scholars, the ultimate challenge for the 21st century is exactly this. Can Yoruba culture continue to modernize, to remix, and to adapt globally without losing its fundamental Okan? Can the internal soul remain completely intact even when the external practices look so entirely different? So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. Is the preservation of the language or the traditional belief system more critical to saving a culture? Based on all the pillars we just analyzed, what do you think is the true bedrock of cultural survival? Thank you so much for exploring this with us today on The Explainer, and keep questioning how our world's amazing cultures will adapt to tomorrow.